driftwood piles up by the jetty at dawn. I walk the tide line where the night is withdrawn. Each piece is a sermon, each knot is a verse from a forest that fell before the ocean's curse. So blessed, depending on how you read the waves. The driftwood carries stories that the water saves, from the rot, from the burn, from the axe and the saw. The driftwood is the only law that the beach respects, that the tide obeys. It deposits the wood in a haphazard maze that I read like a scripture, like a map of the drowned. The driftwood sermon is the only sound that makes sense when the fog is thick as a quilt. The driftwood sermon is the only guilt, washed clean by the salt, by the grind of the sand. The driftwood sermon is the only hand that reaches from the deep, that reaches from the past. The driftwood sermon is the only cast of characters that the coast still remembers. The redwood, the pine, the oak and its embers. They all end up here, they all get the same treatment from the tide. They all get the same name. Driftwood, just driftwood, anonymous and free. The driftwood sermon is the only sea. Driftwood sermon, the tide is the text. Driftwood sermon, what the water rejects. Driftwood sermon, the shore is the pew. I pick up a piece with the bark still on. It smells like the river, it smells like the dawn. Before the Pacific claimed it, before the current took. This wood was part of a mountain brook that fed into a stream, that fed into a river, that fed into the ocean. The ultimate giver and taker. The ocean don't discriminate. It polishes the wood with the patient weight of tons of pressure, of miles adrift. The driftwood sermon is the only gift that the ocean gives back to the land it stole. The driftwood sermon is the only soul of the tree that once stood in a different place. Now it rests in the sand with the smooth, warm face that I trace with my fingers, reading the rings. The driftwood sermon is the only things that matter when the city is too loud to think. The driftwood sermon is the only ink that writes in a language older than the beach. The driftwood sermon is the only speech that the coast delivers without moving its lips. The driftwood sermon is the only ships that come in without sailing, that come in without crew. The driftwood sermon is the only true. Driftwood sermon, the tide is the text. Driftwood sermon, what the water rejects. Driftwood sermon, the shore is the pew. Carry a piece back to the boulevard. It sits on my shelf like a visiting bar. From the kingdom of water, from the realm of the tide. The driftwood sermon is the only guide that leads me back to the coast when the concrete wins. The driftwood sermon is the only sins forgiven by the salt, by the sun, by the moon. The driftwood sermon is the only tune that plays in the static between the stations. The driftwood sermon is the only patience that I can muster when the freeway is a snake. The driftwood sermon is the only break that slows the heart, that slows the mind. The driftwood sermon is the only kind of prayer that I know, a prayer that I trust. The driftwood sermon is the only rust that shines instead of corrodes, that glows instead of fades. The driftwood sermon is the only shades of gray and of brown and of green and of blue. The driftwood sermon is the only true religion that I found on the western edge. The driftwood sermon is the only pledge that I make to the coast, that I make to the wood. The driftwood sermon is the only good that remains when the rest of the world goes sour. The driftwood sermon is the only power. Driftwood sermon, the tide is the text. Driftwood sermon, what the water rejects. Driftwood sermon,